Coming up next, it's Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, here on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry Tales on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Tom and Jerry Tales on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Smurfs on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of the Smurfs on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a pup named Scooby-Doo on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more a pup named Scooby-Doo on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Ben 10, here on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Care Bears Unlock the Magic, here on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's DC Superhero Girls, here on Boomerang. It's the Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack, next on Boomerang. It's Garfield and Friends, next on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's New Looney Tunes, here on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's the Tom and Jerry Show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of the Tom and Jerry Show on Boomerang.
It's a new Scooby-Doo and Guess Who, next on Boomerang. It's Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, next on Boomerang.
Next, it's Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated on Boomerang. Next, it's more Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's What's New Scooby-Doo on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more What's New Scooby-Doo on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Tom and Jerry on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Baby Looney Tunes on Boomerang. Next, it's more Baby Looney Tunes on Boomerang. Next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Reluctant Werewolf on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Camp Scare on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and Kiss Rock and Roll Mystery on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Frank and Creepy on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry Blast Off to Mars on Boomerang. Next, it's Tom and Jerry and the Wizard of Oz on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Bunnicula on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Bunnicula on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Jetsons on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more the Jetsons on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Flintstones on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of the Flintstones on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Wacky Races, here on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry, the Fast and the Furry on Boomerang.
It's Lego Scooby-Doo Haunted Hollywood, next on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Mecha Mud Menace on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Spooky Games on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry, the Lost Dragon on Boomerang. Next, it's Billy and Mandy Save Christmas on Boomerang. Next, it's the Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends Christmas Special on Boomerang. Next, it's the Powerpuff Girls, 'Twas the Fight Before Christmas on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a Flintstones Christmas Carol on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Smurfs Christmas Special on Boomerang. Next, it's Tom and Jerry, Santa's Little Helpers on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Yogi's First Christmas Special on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Haunted Holidays on Boomerang. Next, it's a Flintstone Family Christmas on Boomerang. Next, it's the Christmas Comes to Pac-Land Special on Boomerang. Next, it's Scooby-Doo, the WWE Mystery on Boomerang. Next, it's Tom and Jerry, Robin Hood and his Merry Mouse on Boomerang. Next, it's Tom and Jerry Meet Sherlock Holmes on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Be Cool, Scooby-Doo on Boomerang. Next, it's more Be Cool, Scooby-Doo on Boomerang.
Next, it's Clarence on Boomerang. It's Scooby-Doo and the Gourmet Ghost next on Boomerang. It's Scooby-Doo Shaggy Showdown next on Boomerang.
Next, it's Scooby-Doo and WWE Curse of the Speed Demon on Boomerang. Next, it's Scooby-Doo meets the Boo Brothers on Boomerang.
It's Lego Scooby-Doo Blowout Beach Bash next on Boomerang.
Next, it's Scooby-Doo Mask of the Blue Falcon on Boomerang.
It's the premiere of Lego Scooby-Doo Haunted Hollywood next on Boomerang.
Next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Samurai Sword on Boomerang. Next, it's Scooby-Doo Legend of the Phantasaur on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Curse of the Lake Monster on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Looney Tunes Show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of the Looney Tunes Show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Where Are You on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Scooby-Doo Where Are You on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the new Scooby-Doo movies on Boomerang.
It's Scooby-Doo and Guess Who next on Boomerang.
Next, it's Scooby-Doo Abracadabra-Doo on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Ed, Edd and Eddy on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Powerpuff Girls on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more the Powerpuff Girls on Boomerang. Coming up next, Courage the Cowardly Dog on Boomerang. Coming up next, more Courage the Cowardly Dog on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Adventures, the Mystery Map on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Tom and Jerry's Giant Adventure on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Looney Tunes on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Looney Tunes on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Codename Kids Next Door on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Codename Kids Next Door on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Moon Monster Madness on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Dexter's Laboratory on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the new Scooby-Doo Mysteries on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo Pirates Ahoy on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the Powerpuff Girls on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of the Powerpuff Girls on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Foster's Hope for Imaginary Friends on Boomerang. Next, it's more Foster's Hope for Imaginary Friends on Boomerang. Next, it's Billy and Mandy, Wrath of the Spider Queen on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Ed, Edd and Eddy's Boo-Ha-Ha on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Chowder on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Chowder on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Teen Titans Go on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Teen Titans Go on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Nunchucks on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a new Nunchucks on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's a new Garage Band on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the premiere of Wabbit on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Pink Panther and Pals on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's The Garfield Show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more of The Garfield Show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the new Garfield Show on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's new Shaun the Sheep on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's new Sonic Boom on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's the new series Peanuts on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Grizzy and the Lemmings on Boomerang. it's a new Grizzy and the Lemmings on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Uncle Grandpa on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's more Uncle Grandpa on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's a new amazing world of Gumball on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's more OKKO, Let's Be Heroes on Boomerang.
Coming up next, it's Johnny Test on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Pokemon on Boomerang. Coming up next, it's Pokemon Movie 11, Giratina and the Sky Warrior on Boomerang.
You're watching a special presentation of Summer Camp Island on Boomerang.